Okay. Hi, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thanks so much for coming. Kate and I are talking tonight about sex class. Two quick things before we start. One about questions. We're not quite sure how long our discussion is going to go for. If we've got time, we'd love to take some of your questions, but if not, we're planning to do a follow-up video on feminist heretics. So if you've got questions for us as the discussion goes on, just try to label them clearly, like caps lock question for Kate and Holly, and Joe will be gathering them. And if we get time, we'll take some now, and if not, we'll take care of them in the follow-up video. And then just about the plan for the session. We're going to take about, like, I don't know, 8 to 10, less than 10 minutes each, and sort of try to give a bit of an overview of two distinct positions about sex class. So I'm going to start and talk a bit about the Beauvoir, Firestone et al. Side, and then Kate's going to take over and talk a bit about the Mackinnon, Wittig et al. Side, and then we're just going to kick straight into discussion. So that's the plan for the next 20 minutes or so, and then the rest of the session. Okay, so here's one view of sex. Sex is real. There are two sexes. Although the most important sex differences are hidden from view, so by clothing or by skin, for example, things like internal and external genitals, we can generally detect just by looking who is male and who is female. There are a large number of average differences in appearance, although many exceptions to these average differences. If we had to divide up all the things in the world into the stuff that's there no matter what humans happen to think of it, and the stuff that depends on what humans think of it, sex would be on the there no matter what side. So we would have rocks, trees, mountains, tigers, turtles, and sex differences on the one side, and millions of other things. And then we would have social stuff like universities, marriages, racism, birthdays, and so on the other side. And then the idea would be anyone who puts sex on this side along with birthdays is just granting too much power to humans to create the world. So humans are pretty creative, but the idea is they're not that creative. So there are a number of early feminists who support this view, and Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex is one such person. She writes in chapter 1, which is called Biological Data, males and females are two types of individuals who are differentiated within one species for the purposes of reproduction. She goes over a lot of bad science in the chapter and bad theory about the respective male and female contributions to reproduction, usually designed to show somehow that the male is superior. And she comes to the minimalist conclusion that men and women make a roughly equal contribution, at least initially, to the creation of a new life. So after presenting one particularly silly theory in which men are superior because sperm plays the more active role, Beauvoir writes dryly, it would be rash to deduce from such an observation that woman's place is in the home, but there are rash people. Then a bit later, she says, if one is a bit scrupulous, one has to agree that it is a long way from ovum to woman. So Beauvoir talks about how a woman's role in reproduction creates specific stages in her life, so periods, then pregnancy, and then menopause. But she's really careful about what this doesn't mean. She says, because the body is the instrument of our hold on the world appears different to us depending on how it is grasped. But, she insists, we refuse the idea that they, and here the they refers to data about bodies, that they form a fixed destiny for her. And this is the important bit. They do not suffice to constitute a basis for sexual hierarchy. They do not explain why woman is the other, and they do not condemn her forever after to this subjugated role. So she's very clear that while there are real biological and physiological differences between the sexes, those differences do not ground values. So here's two examples that she gives. One is if men respected or feared women, then their superior strength wouldn't be wielded against women as violence. Another example, how a society values children will then inform how it values women's intimate relation to children. So in conclusion, Beauvoir says, her body is not enough to define her. So biology alone cannot explain women's subordination. It only gives us some limited differences between men and women. Okay, that's Beauvoir. 21 years later, Firestone wrote The Dialectic of Sex. And while she was also very much a realist about sex and sex difference, she had a less minimalist conception than Beauvoir of what the relation between being of the female sex and being oppressed was. So she opens the book with the claim, sex class is so deep as to be invisible. And she goes on, or it may appear as a superficial inequality, one that can be solved by merely a few reforms, or perhaps by the full integration of women into the labor force. But the reaction of the common man, woman, and child, now I quote, that, why, you can't change that, you must be out of your mind, is closest to the truth. We're talking about something every bit as deep as that. This gut reaction, the assumption that even when they don't know it, feminists are talking about changing a fundamental biological condition, is an honest one. That so profound a change cannot be easily fitted into traditional categories of thought, e.g. political, is not because these categories do not apply, but because they are not big enough. Radical feminism bursts through them. If there were another word more all-embracing than revolution, we would use it. So from the words superficial inequality and the idea that we'll need a revolution to solve it in the passage I just quoted, it may seem that the emphasis is on the class part of sex class, not on the sex part. But I think from the later words, feminists are talking about changing a fundamental biological condition, it goes the other way. And it seems she may mean the sex part, or at least that the two are not separable, that sex itself creates class. And that second reading is supported when on the next page she writes, we're dealing with a larger problem with an oppression that goes back beyond recorded history to the animal kingdom itself. So this makes it sound like the problem is sex itself, sex division, or sex difference. And indeed, this will be something like her view. She said that sex class sprang directly from a biological reality. Men and women were created different and not equal. So Firestone thinks men's and women's different reproductive functions lead to the biological family, to men, women, and children, and that this family unit is characterized by 4 facts. First of all, that for all of history up until the invention of birth control, women were at the mercy of their biology, and this made them dependent on the men around them, men in their families or in their societies. That second fact, that human children have a lengthy period of dependency. Third fact, that there is mother-child interdependency. And then fourth, and I think most interesting fact, if it is one, that there is that this natural difference led to social and political difference. So it's worth quoting her precisely on that last alleged fact. She says that the natural reproductive difference between the sexes led directly to the first division of labor at the origins of class, as well as furnishing the paradigm of caste, discrimination based on biological characteristics. So reproductive difference is supposed to create a division of labor. The woman then cares for the young, the man supports her doing so by, for example, providing resources. And this is or creates class, not just difference, but also inferiority, domination, subordination. And for Firestone, it's only because we're no longer just animals that this natural difference leading to class is not morally and politically acceptable anymore. So Firestone thought that women needed to be freed from these reproductive differences in order to be freed from the division of labor, and so from their sex class. So this is the reason why she famously is known to have wanted artificial reproduction, so that children would then be born to both sexes equally. And she envisaged a future where genital differences between human beings would no longer matter culturally. This doesn't mean there being no sex, but it does mean sex not creating class anymore. Okay, I'm handing over to Kate.
Okay. Having discovered that the sexes are classes, feminism faces the question, how do they become classes? Early second wave feminists, paradigmatically, Firestone, perhaps Beauvoir, looked for the answer in biology. This makes sense. What differentiates the sexes are biological qualities, primarily those relating to reproduction. So it must be in this differentiation that the origin of the sexes becoming the classes lies. The basic idea, I think, is that women's biology makes them vulnerable in some way, and that men take advantage of this vulnerability. Perhaps women are, in virtue of their capacity for pregnancy and breastfeeding, dependent on men to hunt for a certain period of time, or burdened with child rearing, as men are not. But men then take advantage of this dependency, compelling women to become husband carers, child carers, home carers, thereby making of a minimal vulnerability a lifelong subordination. This answer suffers two, perhaps three flaws. First, it doesn't account for all women's oppression. If women's reproductive capacity is the source of their oppression, then it will be women who exercise this capacity who are oppressed. So women who have children, perhaps women who marry, perhaps women who are housewives. But what of women who don't exercise this capacity, women who don't have children? How would Firestone account for their oppression? Second, this answer makes better sense of certain ways in which women are mistreated, their role as wife or mother, their consignment to the domestic sphere, the exploitation of their domestic labor, their financial dependence on men. But it makes less sense of other ways that they're mistreated, prostitution, rape, harassment. Third, this answer doesn't cohere these various mistreatments. It seems like women suffer all these disparate wrongs, like there's no systematicity here. Mackinnon, dissatisfied with this answer, the Beauvoir and the Firestone answer, she doesn't so much give a different answer to the question of how the sexes become the classes as turn the question upside down, showing that the creation of sex class is the creation of sex. So the question for her isn't so much how do the sexes as given become the classes, but how is sex class, which is sex, created? And her answer to this, in a word, is sexuality. I'm going to read this lengthy passage from the start of her book, Toward a Feminist Theory of the State. She says, implicit in feminist theory is a parallel argument. The moulding, direction, and expression of sexuality organizes society into two sexes, women and men. This division underlies the totality of social relations. Sexuality is the social process through which social relations of gender are created, organized, expressed, and directed, creating the social beings we know as women and men, as their relations create society. As work is to Marxism, sexuality to feminism is socially constructed, yet constructing, universal as activity, yet historically specific, jointly comprised of matter and mind. As the organized expropriation of the work of some for the benefit of others defines a class, workers, the organized expropriation of the sexuality of some for the use of others defines a sex, woman. Heterosexuality is its social structure, desire its internal dynamic, gender and family its congealed forms, sex roles its qualities generalized to social persona, reproduction a consequence, and control its issue. Mackinnon is arguing that our sexualization, which is our socialization as sexual beings, is our socialization into sex roles or gender. In other words, manhood or womanhood. Some are socialized to eroticized dominance, which socialization is socialization into the gender man, and others are socialized to eroticized subordination, which socialization is their socialization into the gender woman. But this sexualization is not the socialization of the sexes into sex roles or gender. It's simultaneously the creation of sex itself. Notice that Mackinnon doesn't say sexuality organizes the sexes into genders. Rather, she says, sexuality organizes society into two sexes, women and men. The sexes don't precede sexualization. They're the product of it, from Mackinnon. On Firestone's view, sex and class can come apart. The sexes precede class and are turned into it. On Mackinnon's, the creation of the classes is the creation of the sexes. What does she mean? Well, this is my best attempt. From a process of sexualization emerged two distinct groups of people who eroticize dominance, the people we know as men, and people who eroticize subordination, the people we know as women. These two distinct groups of people are distinct also in terms of biology or reproductive system. The people who eroticize dominance, the people we know as men, have certain XY chromosomes and penises, and the people who eroticize subordination, who we know as women, have XX chromosomes and vaginas. In other words, the people who eroticize dominance, the people we know as men, are male, and the people who eroticize subordination, the people we know as women, are female. Mackinnon's not refuting this. She's suggesting that these aspects of biology of the reproductive organs, she's suggesting that they acquire significance or take on a certain meaning as a result of this process of sexualization. So in the bodies of people who eroticize dominance, the reproductive organs become properties that conduce to the eroticization of dominance. And in the bodies of people who eroticize subordination, the reproductive organs become properties that conduce to that eroticization. So thus, for her, does the penis become a weapon with which to penetrate, and the vagina an orifice with which to be penetrated? Something that she thinks Susan Brownmiller just sort of takes for granted. I think what Mackinnon is suggesting is that we read these properties, the reproductive organs, back off the people who possess them, interpreting them in light of what those people are for or what they've been made for or socialized into, right? And we thereby give them, and hence male and female, a meaning that they don't inherently have. Or to put it more simply, only when we're no longer socialized to eroticize dominance and subordination, only when reproductive features are no longer incidentally tied to such eroticization, can we know what those reproductive organs do? Can we know what male and female is? The end of class will be the end of sex as we know it, for Mackinnon. What I think this is an important question, like what does it change? I think importantly, it gives primacy to different forms of mistreatment than the earlier accounts. So I think accounts like Beauvoir's and Firestone's give primacy to forms that relate to women's reproductive system, right? Mackinnon's gives primacy to sexual violations. And the other forms then, I suppose she flips it a little bit, the other forms then become derivative, secondary. That's my best attempt at making sense of Mackinnon, or of this view that class is sex, or the creation of the former is the creation of the latter.
I think you did an amazing job, and you had the harder job. So thank you. Let me maybe just jump into a hard question, and then we can just see where we get to, because I think maybe there's two things we should definitely talk more about. One is the connection that you mentioned between the maleness in man and femaleness in woman, but maybe we could do that second. Maybe we could start with this question of whether is Mackinnon a kind of social constructionist all the way through about sex in the way that Butler and the trans activists are? Because I haven't been watching the chat, but I feel like if I was in the audience, that would be my question. She's supposed to be one of us, but she sounds like the enemy right now. So what would be the response to that? Where is she at on the reality of sex?
I think she is a social constructionist all the way down. She says, in radical feminism, the condition of the sexes and the relevant definition of women as a group is conceived as social down to the somatic level. only incidentally, perhaps even consequentially, is it biological? The even down to the somatic level suggests, I think she is, yes, yeah. Yeah, I think she thinks sex is a product.
And is there any, sorry.
No, I think she thinks it comes at the end, and then we mistake it as the thing that preceded the process.
Is there any way that that's like partly a linguistic disagreement about exactly what sex means? Or is it really that like we have the same, because one thing that I could understand would be like, there's just a real disagreement about how much sex includes. Like, I don't know, do you have a really like big concept of exactly these bodily organs and this maybe sort of statistically normal future, and then maybe she wants to thin that down versus like there's nothing there when we think there's a difference there.
Perhaps it's not that she thinks there's nothing there. It's just that she thinks we can't comment on what's there until we've socialized ourselves otherwise. I don't think the difference is just semantic or linguistic.
Okay, so tell me if I understand. Is it like there's the stuff we think of as femaleness and maleness now, like our sex concepts now, and there's lots packed into those now, and once we really achieve liberation, feminist liberation, getting rid of all the bullshit, we just don't know whether there will be any difference that matters. I don't know whether to say that matters, any difference at all, or any difference worth noting, something like that. Like we should just be agnostic. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. I think she would say we just really can't know what these. I think she would grant there are some anatomical differences, but they wouldn't have the place they do, and they wouldn't have the meaning they do, the function, were it not for our socialization.
Right. So there could just be things we don't, I guess this might be a bad analogy, but there's certain differences, like the way that we've gone with race, for example, right? So we now think, of course, there are skin colors, right? But we don't think there are deep racial differences. So is that a fair analogy? Like she's not going to deny that there are vulvas and penises, but because surely you can't be a social constructionist about literally material reality right in front of you. But the idea is like, but that might just be like being a slightly lighter or darker shade of brown, or
I want to say it would be something more though, because I think Mackinnon thinks that once we drop out all the current meaning, are we still speaking about the same thing? Like once we drop out all the meaning of the penis or the vagina, and those things will then stand in different relations to other parts of the body, perhaps parts of the body that we haven't yet discovered or that aren't yet salient, or that will take on a different meaning. Once you change all of this, doesn't the thing itself have to change? We'll no longer be talking about the same thing.
Good. I guess that's just like a really philosophically, I don't know the answer to that, right? I guess if all the content changes, you should get a new word, right? Like if it's like everything we thought about sex now, the penetrator and the violated and the passive, all that stuff, if everything goes, but if it's like, well, it's less than we thought it was because she can get pregnant, but she need not. And she can be for fucking, but she also can just have sex toys and deliver herself pleasure and have a perfectly happy life. Like, but there's still some of the stuff, right? We just stripped it away and went more minimalist.
Yeah, but that's probably all you can say, some of the stuff. You can't give it names. And I think you're right. I think that's a real possibility that the words might drop out of the vocabulary.
The words for female and male, the words to track sex difference.
Yeah, or perhaps not those words, but perhaps words like maybe vagina and penis, they will, or once the concepts change, perhaps they need new names, right?
Yeah, okay. But there's something still there materially. There's some bodily difference. It's just we give it a new name because it's just like having bigger ears and smaller ears, or being taller or shorter. It's like some insignificant thing that maybe needs maybe, maybe doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, I think like there has to be something there, doesn't there? There have to be some bodies that can be socialized, right, or sexualized. So there does have to be, I mean, I think this is a question from Mackinnon, right? There does have to be something there that the process can operate on. She just thinks that the what is there is not the thing we think it is.
Well, I guess there's two questions going in different time directions, right? One is like in the utopia, like if we get Mackinnon's feminist dreamland, is there sex? And what, if there is some minimal version of what we used to call sex, what is that thing? And then there's, which I think is the direction you're going in, which we should talk about too, like what was there at the start to stick the subordination to? So am I right that at least in the future, there might just be nothing of what we thought?
Yeah.
What we think.
And in that sense, no sex at all, right? Given that all you can mean by sex is what we mean now, or something continuous with that, I think we have to say there'll be no sex in the future.
Good. So that's dramatic. Like we're talking about what sex class is. The fact that there's sex class is what justifies feminism as a project in this feminist dreamland future. There's not just two sexes, but they're not a class anymore. There's not class because there's not sex for Mackinnon. But for Beauvoir and Firestone, there would still be sex. Oh, Firestone's controversial, but at least I think for Beauvoir, there would still be sex, right? It's just there would be no, sex would not be a class anymore.
Okay.
Hey,
so can I ask this? In Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, are you tempted to say those women are, oh gosh, should I have asked? Are you tempted to say they're females?
So
like
for anyone who has read the book, there are no men, right? And they are short hair, very practically clothed,
really athletic,
and there's no sex in the there's just nothing of sex and sexuality at all in the utopia. And then the question is, are they female?
Because like that's the change that Mackinnon envisages, right? So do we think that change is the elimination of sex?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There was actually a bit in Beauvoir where I like deliberately left it out which is slightly intellectually dishonest. But it would complicate the discussion too much, but where she toys with the idea that postmenopausal women are a third sex. And I thought that was very interesting. Yeah, in the sense that like, I mean, she says obviously they're not male, but I think the quote was something like they're no longer female.
Wow.
So maybe that's even someone who was quite a realist and a minimalist about what the sex and sex class is, might still have a very sexually fertile period of life view of femaleness. So maybe she would think in her land. I don't know.
Yeah. I just thought that would be a way of like, what's the intuition? What does that tell us?
Yeah, they're just humans, right? They're fully human.
Yeah.
That is interesting. Let's go to the origins question, I guess, which so ties into when we started. We were thinking about there's this question for Mackinnon about some of the things you quoted her saying just sounds like there's this blob of society, and then somehow something comes along and it divides them, and the division turns out to have people who are eroticized domination and people who are eroticized subordination. And then it's like almost, it's not quite stated who goes which way. And I think I always get really stuck on that when I try to read her. And I don't know.
She says things like masculinity precedes male, right? Femininity precedes female, not the other way around. why can't we entertain that though? That there is a group of people who are differentiated in all of these little trivial ways, and then bit by bit more and more meaning gets attached to that, and then it becomes a bit self-reinforcing. Is that what? Why is that implausible?
No, okay, let me make sure I understand. You mean like there could be any sort of differences, cast our mind back thousands of years, and then there's just like the light brown hair people and the dark brown hair people, and it's like such a trivial difference, no one really means much, but it was used as a basis of dividing society, and then we can just build the shit out of that, like
that's right, like perhaps not systematically to begin with, right? It's just like accidentally it got attributed some meaning, and I guess and then a little bit of a difference got created, and then that seemed to make the meaning true, so then more difference got created, and on it went until you had two really distinct groups of people.
I can see that it starts to look natural, and then the mythology and people socialize their kids into it. But that's very interesting too. So that suggests that this whole thing could have got started. There doesn't need to be any deep fact about differences between people for these kinds of classes to get started.
That's right. And how does so Mackinnon then that sex or reproductive capacity is incidental? These two groups of people got created, and then as it happened, they had these biological features, and then those biological features took on meaning in that context.
I mean, there's going to be this strong temptation from, I think, the Beauvoir Firestone, maybe a lot of our audience, I don't know, side, right, to think that this is maybe almost the difference feminist line. I'm not totally sure, but like that it's such an implausibly minimalist idea that like the mere embodied, like the fact of the embodied experiences of femaleness, of course not all female people have them, but if I think it's like 70% in Australia have children or whatever, right? And then I guess the strong pushback would be, it's so hard to imagine having such substantively different experiences, like Beauvoir talking about the state, what is it like to get a period and then constantly worry about bleeding through your school uniform, right? And what is that like psychologically? What is it like worrying about a pregnancy you don't want, or a pregnancy you desperately do want and can't achieve? And what is menopause like, and all those health things? So I guess I can see someone making a really strong case that like there just are going to be substantial differences, and that they're much more real than other kinds of classes, right? Like, of course, you can just take two identical people and separate them into the bosses and the workers, or say that those ones are the slaves and those ones are the masters. But with sex difference, it looks more real than those other kinds of classes or castes. There's way more you can say about it, the difference. So I don't know, do you have a sense of?
Well, the first thing I wanted to say was, in response to the experiences, mightn't all those experiences have the meaning they do in light of the social construct womanhood?
Have the meaning they do. What does that mean though? That
or the significance that they wouldn't be what they are. So I'm thinking, so perhaps your experience of having a period will be different if being a woman or having a period were something that's filthy or something that needs to be concealed. It wouldn't be something to be ashamed of.
Good. Okay. So you mean
menopause too? What, insofar as you can no longer have a baby, and insofar as having a baby is the sign of being a successful woman in our society, perhaps that experience too. Presumably, it would be different.
Good. So like the more sexist or unaccommodating of women's differences or uniqueness a society is, the more distinctive her experience is going to be. But in a way, that's just going to keep building these unnatural, building and reinforcing these differences that weren't necessarily
that's
the
right.
case.
Yeah. Yeah. So then, of course, you have certain really embodied or somatic experiences.
Right. So we're not trying to imagine away periods, pregnancy, breastfeeding, menopause. It's just how differently could society be organized to accommodate them such that they wouldn't create
Yeah.
really distinctive differences.
Yeah. And then women mightn't be so conscious of them in certain ways. They mightn't be felt as such burdens.
Yeah, I definitely take that point about periods, for example, right? Like how stigmatized that is, and how different that whole thing could be.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know because I just think women would stand in such a different relation to their bodies in the utopia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Like, what is the upshot for? Because I think maybe it's a big mark of our current movement, right? That like we are re-emphasizing the importance of sex against this ridiculous activism that is, I think, not socially constructivist in this very sophisticated Mackinnon type way that tells us to imagine an amazing future of equality and then ask us about difference, right? It's rather science denialist.
Or the differences aren't there now.
Yeah.
Mackinnon thinks the differences are here now because they've been brought about. We shouldn't pretend like they're not here.
I see. That's already helpful, isn't it? So it's not as though if someone buys Mackinnon's line on sex, they're then forced to the Butler type view and made to think that like the gender critical feminist movement is getting it wrong by saying femaleness really matters, because we can say all of that without buying into like necessary, never changing differences of the kind we have now.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's been made to matter. It does matter. We have to do something about it. Once we've achieved liberation, then we might not need to attend to or, provide certain protections. But that's in the future.
Yeah. Good. Okay, that's really helpful.
Yeah. So there's that. I suppose the other thing is I have this worry that sometimes, when we talk about something being, I've become really wary of it, the language of something being socially constructed, but we think then it means it's not real. It doesn't, all it means is it's contingent.
Yes.
I think Mackinnon says this right. Sex is all too real. It's just not necessarily enduring, or it's not immutable.
Yeah, I think that definitely really helps to assuage the worry, right? Because I think the gender critical feminists just need to say it's real. Like it's a difference that exists now and it shows up in these ways, and we're not going to get liberation or equality if we don't accommodate it. That doesn't require having any view at all on its contingency, necessity, exact content, what it would be like in any possible future. That could just be like saying the brown-haired people and the slightly lighter brown-haired people have then had all this socialized stuff built up, but that difference really matters now because it's been 2,000 years of mythologizing about it.
That's right. Yeah. So we need names for those groups of people.
Yeah.
So do you think perhaps it does matter for priorities? Like I was thinking, so on Firestone's view, I think the feminist priorities then center around reproduction, right? For Mackinnon, they center around sexuality.
Yeah.
Sexual violation.
But does the contingency change that? I mean, I can see how it would for the feminists who thought it was necessary, right? So for Firestone thinking it would always lead to reproductive slavery, or for Brown Miller thinking there's always a threat of rape. But does the mere Mackinnon move of saying it's highly contingent and it just is what it is now, I think that doesn't give us sexuality as content. And I think your point was quite right that like that might not explain I mean, you were making that point against Beauvoir and Firestone, but I think it applies to Mackinnon, right? Like there's a big heterogeneous cloud of things that characterize women's mistreatment in the world. And sexuality is all of them.
Yeah, I know, that's right. Perhaps she doesn't, perhaps she doesn't cohere them better. She just flips them around.
Yeah. And maybe she catches more. I think that's definitely right.
She might.
Yeah, if you're just thinking it's like, oh, that women are penetrable, therefore there's a rape worry. Of course, you're catching less than Mackinnon's catching. And I think for her time of writing, catching this whole net of things to do with sexual harassment.
Emerging issues or things being talked about in consciousness raising.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then maybe she would, I mean, I guess we could ask her, but like, she would probably have to admit that that's been a big criticism of her, right? That like, how do you catch the domestic slave, the woman the man has long since lost sexual interest in her, but she has to do the cooking all the time and the cleaning. It's like, that's not really a sexuality issue, but it's a widespread coordination issue.
Yeah, right. No, I'm not sure that you could say that's not a sexuality issue. I think Mackinnon has a really expansive concept of sexuality.
Well, that's one way to do it.
I think it's a process. She does talk, she talks a little bit about this. I mean, it's hard to work out what the concept is, but I guess insofar as she thinks conquest is eroticized, she thinks anything that has some conquest in it is sexual. So how did you put it? Mere subordination? She's going to say, no, that is therefore sexual.
I see. That's a sneaky move theoretically, isn't it? Like everything is sexuality now.
Yeah. I see what you mean. I mean, she gives a fair bit of empirical evidence for it. I think she does dissolve a little bit this distinction between physical abuse and sexual abuse, and she's got a lot of empirical evidence on her side for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if we could get a lesson about sex class out of all of this, I mean, is it fair to say something like that it's the class, not the sex? That's the important thing. I don't know, because that's sort of what came up in Firestone, right? Like we have the sex class, like it's a class, there's subordination and it's this thing, but is it the subordination we should be, just happens to be those people, but we should care about their state? Or is it like there's something really in the what sex is and what constituency that picks out and what its content is and why that explains the class part in the first place? Like, where should our feminist focus be?
Yeah, I really like that point, that the emphasis should be on the class, not the sex. And I suspect that's where Mackinnon thinks earlier feminists went wrong, right? By accidentally shifting the focus back from the class to the sex, looking for the answer in biology. Yeah, and I suppose I think isn't it a really remarkable discovery that sex is class? I think we can't fully appreciate that sex is class. I mean, you sort of gestured at this earlier, didn't you, when you suggested, okay, does perhaps the relationship between capitalists and workers, or bosses and workers, seems more obviously one of class, but the sexes, that thing thought most natural, the people who are in relations of desire and love, like Firestone's right. It's about the invisibility. Yeah. So I think it's this really remarkable achievement, and my sense is that it's precarious, or we have to keep remembering women are a class. Yeah,
no, I think that's right. And again, I think it stands out so much against other paradigm oppressed groups, because it's just easier to see how flimsy the differences are in other cases. So it's more obvious to us, right? Or you get these cases of passing or whatever, like easily the worker could have been the boss. They could just disguise themselves as the boss and they'll be treated as the boss, right? Or there's so many cases of racial passing that have been interesting in history. But with women, I don't know if it's distinctive because I haven't thought about all the kinds of oppression, but it does seem like the one where it's got so much built into it that makes it look like there are such serious and radical differences that it looks legitimate. So I think you're right. It's like really hard to see or at least for many people, really hard to see and really hard to remember, that it's like a difference that's been made into subordination.
Yeah. And think about how, I feel like other forms of class always seem to sort of displace it. We talk about privileged women, or some people do, if women are privileged in certain ways, it seems to somehow make it obvious that they're not oppressed. If they have money or if they're white. Feminism is the discovery that those people are oppressed.
Yeah. So much reluctance to admitting that, isn't there?
Yeah. Including by feminists.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, shall we ask Jo if we have any questions? Do you feel ready?
Yeah.
Jo, do we have any questions to take?
Yeah, so we've got I've put in loads of it turns out we can't chat I couldn't save from the chat, so I've screenshot loads of things, but this is going backwards. This is just the most recent things. And we also have some Q&A, and I think that Holly and Kate, you can click on the Q&A, and to some extent, it might be worth it going for those 3 Q&A first.
Okay, good. Kate, can you see those? Like down where the chat is?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing this for the moment, and then we can do this bit after. Yeah.
You can have a look for it. Okay. Where does T Grace stand on sex class? Oh, very good. I should have brushed up on that before the session. I would have put her on the Beauvoir Firestone side.
Yeah.
Although she does have that line, she has this one line, right, about women having to annihilate their own definition. I'm misquoting it wildly. But that would be the one bit where it looks like she might be leaning towards the pansexual human's future.
Yeah. And this is true, I think, of a lot of feminists, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I was so shocked. I remember talking to you about this at the time when I first started researching for my book, because I had this totally naive conception that the trans activists are all sex denialists and the rad femmes are all like these, like really, they all believe in sex and they all want a future where the sexes are not in a hierarchy. Yeah. And then I kept finding these comments, right, about like sex is really a continuum, or, things that sounded awfully trans activist, or things that were at least eventually seeming to imagine those differences away.
Yeah. Hey, do you think that might be a way of naming or capturing the difference? Trans activists as sex denialists, is that how you put it? And perhaps some of these feminists as sex eliminativists?
Yeah, I think that
some are saying it's not here, others are saying we wish that it weren't.
Yeah, good. So they don't have to, none of the second waivers were denying whatever there was there now, and in fact that was what was driving them, right?
Yeah, like, that's right.
This hierarchy now, but they imagined a future in which it wouldn't matter.
Yeah.
And I would almost suspect that it was more of them that were imagining we would hardly have it at all, or we wouldn't notice those differences.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. Sometimes we play up the differences, I think. The discontinuity.
But I like that. The trans activists are denialists about a thing that's very real and very important right now, regardless of what future we all envisage.
That's right. Yeah.
Good. Okay, next question. What are the implications on lesbianism or on female separatism in general for each of these theorists? Firestone and Mackinnon.
Yeah. I mean, Mackinnon's a little bit critical of political lesbianism, or complicates it as a solution, I suppose. I guess she thinks lesbianism doesn't escape sexuality as it is. Mm-hmm. So those relationships will often be modeled on, or will mimic hierarchical relationships.
Right. So the transformation that she envisages will have implications for what lesbianism means and as a practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess another thing to say about that question would just be that maybe it's separatism. Oh, I don't know if you disagree with me if you want, but maybe separatism is left intact as an interim strategy, right? Because we still have sex difference as real and important in the short term,
definitely,
regardless of what future. And so then we can just still argue as feminists about what strategies are the best ones to take us to liberation. And it might be that separatism is what we need, like to get away and get really creative and build solidarity and then burst forth for the revolution.
I mean, I think all these feminists would have to agree that separatism is necessary, in fact, in order to acquire sex consciousness for a start. And Mackinnon talks about the integrality of separatism, or women being with women and not having men's presence in consciousness raising. Interestingly, I wonder if actually on the Mackinnon sort of Wittig view, separatism could be more than instrumental. On Firestone's view, men and women would still have to be in sexual relations, wouldn't they? Given what reproduction is.
You mean in her utopia, or in her?
Even in her utopia, yeah.
Yeah, I guess she just wants them both making genetic material donations to the lab and then being equal parents.
Right.
Like, she wasn't exactly imagining a different family, right? She was,
now
they're both equally the parent in the nuclear family. Okay, someone told me to read the questions more clearly, and that is reasonable feedback. So sorry, I was just mumbling them because I thought everyone can see them. Next question. Do you think that, do you want to do it?
There you go.
Do you think the utopian strain within feminism is beneficial or politically detrimental? Very good.
Beneficial. Janice Raymond has this great line in her book, A Passion for Friends, about the importance of vision for feminism. And Richard Rorty talks in I think in a paper about pragmatism and feminism on how you can't, like, critique won't get you anywhere if you don't have anything to move to. You have to have a vision. And I suppose I think the vision, the more utopian, the better, right? The more utopian the vision, the worse the present will seem in contrast.
Which is motivating.
That's right. And the more inspired, you'll be to struggle.
Yeah. I have the same instinct as you, but I can sort of feel the criticism at the shoulder, which is like, oh, the idiots with the head in the clouds that aren't taking seriously the practical realities of today. So I can sort of see if it's like, should we just be in our little chambers plotting our ideal version of the future versus like out on the streets helping real suffering people now? I sort of see that.
Can't we do both?
Yeah, or we could divide labor somehow, and the people that are good at dreaming can do some dreaming, and the people that are good at helping can do some helping.
Yeah.
I totally agree, we need both. It's not like we should get rid of the visionaries and just take care of minimal suffering. But the
feminism is necessarily a revolutionary movement though, right? And in that sense, it does have to be utopian. Like, it has to imagine a reality that is at present inconceivable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's already so much vision just in the women in the 50s looking around and being like, fuck this.
Yeah.
Right? Hugely utopian, thinking, oh, what about a future in which we're all just human?
I wonder that if we always look back and we think, no, those women were pragmatists, what women are proposing now, that's preposterous.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Do you want to clearly read the next one?
Dworkin says in her Intercourse that intercourse makes women fundamentally vulnerable because it involves penetration. Is that an implied acknowledgement that women's biology does in some ways make them vulnerable, inferior? Just supposing. Great question. I I'm tempted to say no. I don't think she does. So that's the Brown Miller view, right? I don't think Dworkin does think that. Perhaps she would say it makes them vulnerable, given what the current meaning of intercourse is.
Yeah.
But they're not inherently, insofar as intercourse doesn't inherently have to be an act of conquest or an act of violation or invasion, possession. Women aren't inherently vulnerable, or the female body isn't.
Yeah, that seems right. I mean, again, I don't know if she has said things elsewhere that might imply more of a necessary understanding of that vulnerability, but if it's just this claim that it makes women vulnerable, that could just be a claim about what things are like around here in the last 50 years or 1,000 years, right? As the social meaning we have come to have, this is a true claim, but it doesn't mean buying into this.
I think Dworkin is actually really helpful for thinking through this idea that femaleness is contingent and yet really significant and needs to be attended to.
Yeah.
So insofar as female bodies have vaginas, then they're going to, insofar as that's thought of as an orifice, they're going to be vulnerable.
Yeah, I love that bit. Was it in Beauvoir that when we were rereading today, when she said something about I'm going to get the quote wrong again, but it was like, it made a comparison to not thinking about, no, it's Mackinnon, isn't it? Where the person that says, like, it's hard to imagine women lying predatory in the bush waiting to jump out and engulf a penis.
Yes, yeah, I'm sure it's Mackinnon. Yeah.
So trying to reimagine, like, why is it that we think just because there's a cavity that person is penetrable / rapeable? Like you can imagine the power dynamics the other way around, and the women are plotting. So I thought that was quite striking.
Yeah. It's got to be a constraint on our imagination, though, that we can only envisage the opposite. Not the utopia.
I thought she made the point well. Okay, that's all our Q&A questions. We've got 2 minutes. Jo, have you got one question from the other list that you want to give us?
Yeah, yes, I am still. You can hear me. I'll share the screen. So this one, I thought there's one from next week's speaker actually here, Caroline Norma, who's one along with Julia Long. She says, if sexuality is the name of the political system and set of practices that bring about women's sex class, then sex would surely be the last thing that exists out of women's liberation. That's a sort of thing I thought maybe you could comment on.
Sex would surely be the last thing that exists. Do you know what that means, Kate?
Yeah, I think Caroline's saying insofar as women as a class are created in sexual practices, as Mackinnon thinks they are, then there's no way you could have women as not a class and still have sexual practices. Or perhaps I'm mistaking sex for sexual practices.
Yeah, I think I don't quite get the last bit. Like, sex would surely be the last thing that exists. Does it mean it will be the last thing to go? Because that would make sense to me.
No.
That we need it so that we can fight for our liberation until the very last minute. But I'm not sure that's what she means.
I think, do we have a question about which sense of sex, perhaps?
Oh, maybe.
I mean,
sorry, Caroline.
Yes. Sorry, Caroline.
Oh, well, we're at 10. We made a hash of the last question, but
sorry, Caroline.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Oh, no, sexuality. No, she clarified sexuality and sexual practices. We did understand her.
Oh, good. Did you answer?
Yeah.
Did we adequately answer? I didn't.
She's totally right.
Awesome.
There's no room in that future for sexual practices.
But for sex, for having sex,
But
having
which,
orgasm? Is there room for orgasms?
Look, perhaps you could say orgasms. I wonder if Caroline perhaps might want to say, oh, you know, like if that takes its meaning from current sexual practices, then that's going to be a different thing too, right?
Right.
Maybe a more diffuse thing.
There may or may not be any pleasure in the utopia.
Pleasure will take different forms, or maybe the orgasm won't be such a big deal.
Yeah, okay. I guess it's a whole big other set of questions. Okay, we're at time, so we're just gonna thank you so much everyone for coming and putting up with us. It's been really
Thanks. Fun. Thank you.
How to end